guys, welcome to Chapter 8, Kyushu 4. We're going to be looking at why states compete and cooperate with one another. There's also some other types of boundaries thrown in here. It's kind of just tying up all the loose ends of Chapter 8 that you need to know that are not in your book. Okay, so first off, we're going to talk about a couple of different boundaries and borders that we haven't really talked about before. So you can kind of add these to your list. An antecedent boundary is a boundary that was made before it was settled by humans. So this is usually a physical border or boundary, like mountains or rivers. And then a subsequent boundary are those settled as a culture develops. So a border that as a people move in, they make their own boundaries. So those are subsequent boundaries. Okay. My example is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Okay, this was decided because in Northern Ireland they are mostly Protestant. In the Republic of Ireland they're mostly Catholic, so they did a border based on cultural reasons, but it's a subsequent border because it's something that they decided after they had already settled. Okay, there's also a superimposed boundary, which is a boundary that is formed by an outside party. So when you guys did partition of Bowman, this is what you were trying to avoid, having a superimposed boundary, because then you get things like the Scramble for Africa, where all of these boundaries were decided by other parties, right? And then when they all left, it was kind of up to them to figure out how to live together, so that was a problem. And then a relict boundary is a boundary that doesn't exist anymore. So an example of that would be the Berlin Wall that used to be up between East and West Germany during the Cold War, which we're going to talk about in a second. And it separated West Germany that was controlled by democratic powers and East Germany that was controlled by Soviet communist power. Okay. The other thing, these aren't really boundaries, but they kind of go in that category, is an enclave and an exclave. An enclave is a state that is completely surrounded by another state. So this example is South Africa and Lesotho. So it's a perforated state, South Africa, and that little punch that's in South Africa is another country, Lesotho, which is surrounded by South Africa. Vatican City, which is inside of Italy but considered its own state, would also be an example. And then an exclave is an area completely separated from its state by another state. So an example of that would be Alaska. Okay. And then a shatter belt is a region caught up in conflicts that cause persistent stress and eventually cause fragmentation. So an example of a shatter belt would be this, all of the Balkan area right here. It was made up of many different peoples speaking different languages, different religions. It was an area of conflict that led us into World War I. It was still a conflict during World War II. And then finally, they drew their own borders and separated into different countries. So it was a shatter belt. Now it's just a bunch of different countries. And then a little bit later, Yugoslavia is broken up as well for the same reasons. Okay. So then the Cold War, just really briefly, is between two opposing superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. After World War II, we've kind of talked about this. The US becomes the most powerful country in the world, which it had never been before because most of Europe was broke. And their opposing superpower was the Soviet Union, which is Russia. It's not in existence anymore, but it's Russia, and all the states that Russia controlled together was called the Soviet Union. Now those states are independent, so there's just Russia and states like Albania and Bulgaria. So the situation leads to cooperation and competition. So cooperation with the United States and its allies, cooperation with the Soviet Union and its allies, but then competition between the two. So a lot of the things we're going to talk about following this are born during the Cold War. So it took place between 1945 and 1900. And we call it a Cold War because they never actually fought between each other. There wasn't like a war in the traditional sense. They mostly threatened each other. The closest we ever came to nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis, but luckily that didn't happen. And what is born from the Cold War is two rival alliances. So there's NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the military alliance between the U.S. and its allies against the Soviet Union. And then because the Soviet Union learned of NATO, they made their own military alliance with themselves and their allies, and that is called the Warsaw Pact. So once the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union goes through a process of devolution. This is basically the same thing as balkanization. You can use this to interchangeably for the most part. So all of the red here were Warsaw Pact states. They were all considered part of the Soviet Union. It devolves into smaller states, so this becomes Russia over here. And these all become independent countries. And then East Germany and West Germany eventually are reunited, and that's when the Berlin Wall comes down between the two. But that's what devolution is. It's when you break up into smaller autonomous states. Okay, so so NATO would be an example of a supranational organization. The Warsaw Pact would be an example of a supranational organization, and they become really popular during the Cold War and following World War II because it was understood after World War II that states needed to work together in order to prevent another world war from happening. So a supranation is just a collection of states that work together for some sort of purpose. Both NATO and the Warsaw Pact are military alliances. There's also the European Union, which is an economic alliance. So basically, there's a bunch of countries in Europe that are part of the European Union. They all have the same currency, which is the euro, although some states opted out to do that. And then they have free trade from state to state and rely on each other for economic benefits. So the idea is, since they rely on each other, they won't go to war with one another. There's a lot of controversy going on in Britain right now because Britain has elected to leave the European Union, and they're finding that that's a lot harder than they thought it was going to be. So I think they have to be out by March 2019. So it's something to kind of keep your eye on. And then, just like with the Warsaw Pact and NATO, the Soviet states discovered that the EU was being put together, so they did the same thing, so that they came up with ComCon, which does the same thing, basically, that the European Union does. It was formed in 1949. And it's an alliance of communist states to promote trade. It doesn't exist the way that it used to anymore, but the European Union is still going strong, minus Britain. And then the United Nations, which you guys are familiar with, was created after World War II, and this is a peacekeeping organization. So Warsaw Pact, NATO, both military alliances, European Union, ComCon, both economic alliances. The United Nations is more like a diplomatic alliance where they try to resolve conflict with each other. Okay, another example of competition amongst states would be terrorism, which you guys are probably familiar with. And terrorism gets thrown around a lot, the term, but it has a very specific definition, which is the use of violence and intimidation in the pursuit of political goals. So just because somebody creates havoc, unless it's to obtain a specific purpose and not just rack up a body count, then it's not terrorism. So there's a big difference between, let's say, like the mass shooting in Las Vegas and the bombing of the World Trade Center. Those are two completely different things because one had a goal in mind, and the other one we're not really sure what was going on, right? It's also different than acts of war or assassinations because acts of terror are aimed at ordinary civilians. It's not focused on a single person of power the way assassinations are. And that's one way that states might conflict with each other. Okay, and then something else that states can do is states can fail, meaning they can be a state and then something can happen and they cease to be a state. This is different than devolution or balkanization. It's not that it breaks up into smaller states, it just kind of ceases to be that entity. It doesn't disappear off the map. Oftentimes people will stay in that state, but there's just no control and cohesiveness within that state anymore. So there's lots of reasons why this could happen. It could be physical geography that makes a state difficult to unify. That doesn't happen as much anymore because of technology. Ethnic separatism, the breakup of Yugoslavia, even though that did eventually go through a process of devolution, before that it was considered a failed state. A terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda or the Taliban could push out existing governments with violence and intimidation. Afghanistan for a time could have been considered a failed state. Iraq could be considered possibly a failed state. These countries where ISIS has come in and basically taken control because the official government has lost control, those would be considered failed states. It could be economic and social problems like civil wars. The U.S. during our Civil War would have been considered a failed state because it was broken up into two different entities without the approval of the federal government. So during that time, we could be considered a failed state. This is sort of what is happening in Venezuela currently. We're going to read an article about what Venezuela is going through. They would, at this point, they are considered a failed state. They might recover, who knows. And then irredentism could also lead to a failed state if there's a restoration of cultural attributes like Nazi Germany or the Islamic State. So, for example, because, well, I don't know if that's a good example in Nazi Germany, but the Islamic State, what ISIS is doing is they are trying to form a unified state with all Muslim peoples all over the world, and they believe that that should be in the Middle East. So why they're trying to push out governments in the Middle East is to get rid of them to do that. So there's is kind of a combination between terrorism and irredentism that's making a lot of those states in the Middle East failed states. Okay. And then really quick, devolution and technology have started to work together to bring lots of changes, especially in the Middle East. Technology leads to more centrifugal forces and different cultural identities. So remember, centrifugal forces are forces that break people apart. Centripetal forces are things that bring people together. There's more calls for democracy over autocracies and dictatorships. So basically what has happened in the Middle East is we started with a country called Tunisia, who had their revolution and was able to overthrow their government and is now, albeit a shaky democracy, but they are a democracy. And then Libya and Egypt have followed, and Syria this is why they're in a civil war right now, and also would be considered a failed state because they followed the Arab Spring. They wanted to get rid of their dictator, and now they're just in a civil war, and you guys are familiar with that because of the refugee crisis that's coming out of those countries. Okay, so that is why the world has kind of really stuck to these supranational organizations like the UN and the EU. It's just less likely that some of those things are going to happen in theory. Okay, and that's it. That was relatively quick. So hopefully you took good notes, and expect a pop quiz as usual.